Even though the female race is barely allowed to freely express it, anger is for everyone. While anger is a signal worth listening to, women have long been discouraged from its awareness and forthright expression. Women are seen as the nurturers, the soothers, the peacemakers and the steadiers of rocked boats. It is their job to please, protect and placate the world. Women are expected to hold relationships in place, as if their lives depended on it. Unlike male heroes who fight and even die for what they believe in, women are usually condemned for waging a bloodless and humane revolution for their own rights. The direct expression of anger, especially at men, makes us unladylike, unfeminine, unmaternal, sexually unattractive, or even strident. The taboos against a woman's feelings and expression of anger are so powerful that even knowing when a woman is angry is not a simple matter. When a woman shows her anger, she is likely to be dismissed as irrational or worse. Therefore, we barely know, let alone admit that we're angry. Many times, we even ask ourselves questions that invalidate our experiences of anger. Do I have the right to get angry? Is my anger legitimate? To ask, is my anger legitimate, is similar to asking, do I have a right to be thirsty? I just had a glass of water 15 minutes ago. Surely my thirst is not legitimate. And besides, what's the point of getting thirsty when I can't get anything to drink now, anyway? Anger is something we feel. It exists for a reason and always deserves our respect and attention. We all have a right to everything we feel, and certainly our anger is no exception. Women need to learn to use their anger energy in the service of their own dignity and growth. This piece is designed to help women move away from styles of managing anger that do not work for us in the long run, such as silent submission, ineffective fighting and blaming, and emotional distancing. We can learn how to use our anger as a starting point to change patterns rather than blame people. Every woman needs to know that excessive compromise does more harm than good. Our anger can motivate us to say no to the ways in which we are defined by others and yes to the dictates of our inner self. Harriet Lerner. Oftentimes, we allow ourselves to be written off and we give others the excuse to not take us seriously and hear what we're saying. Instead of unnecessary anger, we should use anger as a constructive tool for clarifying our position and changing relationships rather than blaming people. Women can use anger to change relationships by harnessing their skills in the following areas: tune into the true sources of our anger and clarify where we stand. Learn communication skills. Learn to observe and interrupt non-productive patterns of interaction. Learn to anticipate and deal with countermoves or change back reactions from others. Some women do not have a problem getting angry, the problem is that they fight in a manner that sabotages any occurrence of the change. We try to protect our partner and the status quo of our relationships at the expense of our own growth, deselfing ourselves for the man. Deselfing means that too much of a woman's self, including her thoughts, wants, beliefs, and ambitions, is negotiable under pressures from the relationship. Deselfing takes an inevitable toll on an individual, even when the person doing the most compromising of self doesn't know it. The most common form of deselfing in women is called underfunctioning. Underfunctioning can take different forms. It may be as subtle as a wife turning down a job opportunity or avoiding a new challenge when her husband gives a covert communication that he would prefer things to remain as they are, or when she fears he would feel threatened by such a change. A woman may protect her man by confining herself to work that he prefers not to do and by failing to recognize and develop interests and skills in his areas. She may, in the process, acquire emotional or physical problems. The way to solve the problem of deselfing in relationships is making efforts to strike the balance between individualism, the I, and togetherness, the we. We all need to have both an I and we that nourish and give meaning to each other. Did you know? The human language does not have one unflattering term to describe men who vent their anger on women. Even such epithets as bastard and son of a bitch do not condemn the man but place the blame on a woman, his mother. When trying to effect a change, we need to be tactical about it. Turning theory and good intentions into practice is especially challenging with close members of one's family. Our relationships with our parents and siblings are the most influential in our lives, and they are always as delicate as they come. Families tend to establish rigid rules and roles that govern how each member is to think, feel, and behave, and these are not easily challenged or changed. And when one individual in a family begins to behave in a new way that does not conform to the family way, anxiety skyrockets, and before long, everyone is trying so hard to reinstate the old familiar patterns. Rather than face the strong feelings of anxiety and discomfort that are inevitably evoked when we clarify a new position in an old relationship, we may instead do the very two things with our anger that only serve to block the possibility that change will occur. First, we may confront the concerned members of our family by telling them what's wrong with them and how they should think, feel, or behave differently. That way, we try to change the other person, and because that never goes right, the other person becomes upset and defensive. In response, we become frustrated or guilty and allow things to return to the usual pattern, concluding that he or she can't change. Another way we can sabotage change is by cutting ourselves off from our parents or siblings emotionally or geographically. The fastest cure for chronic anger or frustration is simply to leave home, or to find a sympathetic therapist who will reparent us. We can keep family visits few and far between, or we can keep them polite and superficial. True enough, such distancing does bring short-term relief by lowering the anxiety and emotional intensity in these relationships. It also rids us of the uncomfortable feelings that may be evoked upon closer emotional contact. The problem is that there is a long-term cost. All the unresolved emotional intensity is likely to get played out in another important relationship, such as that with a spouse or even a child. Emotional distancing from our first family actually prevents us from proceeding calmly and clearly in new relationships. When we learn to move differently in our family and get unstuck in these important relationships, we will function with greater satisfaction in every relationship we are in. We can learn to do something different with our anger. We can proceed to work on achieving greater independence as well as an increased capacity for intimacy and togetherness at any stage of our lives. It helps to renegotiate relationships with our family members because the degree of self that we exude will greatly influence the nature of our current relationships. We should shape up our method of communication to get what we want. Surely, the easiest way to get what we want, as women, is through constructive communication. And that inspires the notion of turning anger into I messages. Using I messages simply entails changing your communications into I feel communications. Venting anger in the form of complaining at our respective partners doesn't solve any problem. Every you message, for example, you could cut yourself, could be turned into an I message, a non-blaming statement about ourselves. Shifting from the you message to the I message works like a spell, as it will make the other person surrender to our wants without anger, struggle, or any loss of pride. While it is far from realistic to use the I message all the time, it is helpful in cases where we want to have our way without coming off as too demanding or controlling. If the goal is to break a pattern in an important relationship and develop a stronger sense of self to bring to relationships, it is essential that we learn to translate our anger into clear, non-blaming statements about ourselves. We maximize the opportunity for constructive dialogue if we say, I feel like I'm not being heard, rather than, you don't know how to listen. Learning to use anger effectively requires some letting go of blaming that other person whom we see as causing your problems and failing to provide for our happiness, letting go of the notion that it is our job to change other people or tell them how they should think, feel, behave. However, this does not mean that we passively accept or go along with any behavior. In fact, a live and let live attitude can signal a deself position, so we should never fail to clarify what is and is not acceptable to us in a relationship. The main issue is how to clarify our position. Women often fear that having a clear I means threatening a relationship or losing an important person. Thus, rather than use our anger as a challenge to think more clearly about the I in our relationships, we may, when angry, actually blur out what personal clarity we do have. We have to be careful to avoid this. We can't let unconscious fears of destructiveness and of separateness block us from maintaining our clarity and using our anger as a challenge to take a new position or action on our own behalf. We must transform our anger into productive action and use it as an incentive to sort out what we want. It is very important that women observe the feminine, characteristic style of managing anger. We all have predictable patterned ways of managing anger and conflict, though they may vary in different relationships. For example, a woman may fight with her mother, distance from her father, underfunction with her boss, and obsess over her boyfriend. It helps to make a mental note of one's usual style of negotiating relationships in the midst of anger. The following basic styles are guidelines. Pursuers, they react to anxiety by seeking greater togetherness in a relationship, place high value on talking things out and expressing feelings, feel rejected when someone close wants more time and space away from the relationship, and may negatively label themselves as too dependent or too demanding in a relationship. They also tend to criticize their partner as someone who can't handle feelings or tolerate closeness. Distancers, they seek emotional distance or physical space when stress is high and manage anxiety in personal relationships by intensifying work-related projects. They consider themselves to be self-reliant, more do-it-yourselfers than help-seekers, and have difficulty showing their needy and vulnerable sides. As a result, they are emotionally unavailable and unable to deal with feelings from significant others. They may even cut off a relationship when things get intense rather than working it out. However, despite their closed-up nature, distancers do open up when they are not pushed. Underfunctioners, these people tend to have several areas where they just can't get organized. They become less competent under stress, and tend to develop physical or emotional symptoms in stressed situations. They are seen as the fragile ones in the family and may become the focus of family concern as they have difficulty showing their strong, competent side to intimate others. Overfunctioners, these ones know what's best, not only for themselves but for others as well, and come quickly to the rescue when stress hits. Overfunctioners avoid worrying about their own personal goals and problems by focusing on others. They are always reliable. However, they have difficulty sharing their own vulnerable, underfunctioning side, especially with those people who are viewed as having problems. Blamers respond to anxiety with emotional intensity and fighting as they have a short fuse. They are known to hold another person responsible for their own feelings, expending high levels of energy trying to change someone who does not want to change. They engage in repetitive cycles of fighting that relieve tension but perpetuate the old pattern. It is important to note that none of these categories is good or bad, right or wrong. They are simply different ways of managing anxiety. As women, we must observe our characteristic style of managing anger and negotiating relationships. And as we do that, we should study other people's styles too. How does their style interact with ours? It is vital that we get as much practice as we can observing the interactional sequences in which our anger is embedded. And when things get hot, step back a bit in order to keep track of the recent events. Observing is a skill that is definitely worth developing before a woman attempts to perform a daring and courageous act. It is important to be prepared for resistance when negotiating new positions in relationships. During an attempt to shift a pattern, every woman must be prepared for the intense reaction from others, as well as an inner resistance. If anxiety about change is very high in a woman's family or other intimate relationships, she may want to begin working on a relationship that is more flexible and less intense, perhaps with a coworker, neighbor, or friend. Wherever we begin and whatever task we choose for ourselves, here is a review of some basic do's and don'ts to keep in mind when we are feeling angry. Speak up when an issue is important to you. While we do not have to pay mind to every injustice and irritation that comes along, it is a mistake to stay silent if the cost is to feel bitter, resentful, or unhappy. Don't strike while the iron is hot. A good fight will clear the air in some relationships, but if our goal is to change an entrenched pattern, the worst time to speak up is when we are feeling angry or intense. Do take time out to think about the problem and clarify every position. Speak in I language, learn to say, I think, I feel, I fear, I want, etc. A true I statement says something about the self without criticizing or blaming the other person and without holding the other person responsible for our feelings or reactions. However, we need to watch out for disguised you statements or pseudo I statements like I think you are controlling and self-centered. Don't make vague requests. When making our wants known, we should avoid saying things like I want you to be more sensitive to my needs. Instead, we should be clearer and let the other person know specifically what we want. The best way that you can help me now is simply to listen. I really don't want advice at this time. We should understand that the people around us are not mind readers, so we cannot expect them to anticipate our needs or do things that we have not requested. Do try to appreciate the fact that people are different. We move away from fused relationships when we recognize that there are as many ways of seeing the world as there are people in it. Different perspectives and ways of reacting do not necessarily mean that one person is right and the other wrong. Don't participate in intellectual arguments that go nowhere. We shouldn't spin our wheels trying to convince others of the rightness of our position. If the other person does not seem to agree with us, we should simply say, "I understand that you disagree, but I guess we see it differently." It helps to accept that perspectives differ. Do recognize that each person is responsible for his or her own behavior. It's unfair for a person to blame his or her dad's new wife because she won't let him be close to him or her. Rather, it is that person's responsibility to find a new way to approach the situation. A man's behavior is his responsibility, not his wife's. We must be able to take responsibility for our own part in maintaining the very patterns that evoke our anger. Conclusion. Becoming one's own person is a task that one ultimately does alone, no one else can or will do it. Yet, it is a challenging task that can't be done in isolation. Only through connectedness with others can we, as women, define ourselves. There is a circular connection between the patterns of our intimate relationships and the degree to which women are represented, valued, and empowered in every aspect of society and culture. The patterns that keep us stuck in our close relationships are the results of a stuck society. For this reason, it is not enough for women to individually learn to move differently in personal relationships. We all have to come together to challenge and change the societal institutions that keep women in a subordinate and self position outside the home, or what goes on inside the home will continue to be a problem for us all. If we all use our anger to create new and more functional relationship patterns, there will be no more dysfunctional model to follow. Let every woman carefully listen to her own anger and use it in the service of change. If we all can do this, we will surely make great pioneers. Try this: when you're angry about something, always hash it out with the concerned person. A firm but the gentle dialogue always works.